The first thing you learn when you work in a royal kitchen is that heat has no mercy. It does not care that you are 17 and still growing into your hands. It does not care that your knuckles are raw from scrubbing copper pots or that the smoke from the roasting fires has embedded itself so deeply into your hair that you carry the scent of charred rosemary everywhere you go. The fire simply burns, the bread simply rises or does not, the sauce simply reduces or it scorches. There is no room for sentiment inside a kitchen, and there is certainly no room for a low-born Omega boy with stars in his eyes and flour permanently caked under his fingernails. My name is Carl Rush, and this is the story of how I accidentally ruined, or perhaps saved, the most important political event in our kingdom's recent history. I did not plan any of it. I want that understood from the start. I was 22 years old in the autumn that changed everything. 5 years into my position as junior sous chef to head cook Marin, I had earned a small measure of reputation. Not outside the palace walls. Out there, I was nobody, the third son of a Rivertown merchant who had died of fever when I was 12, leaving my mother with debts and 3 children and a stubborn pride that refused to let us sink entirely. I had come to the capital with a letter of recommendation from the local lord and a desperate, aching hunger that had nothing to do with food. Inside the palace kitchens, though, inside those low-ceilinged, steam-filled, glorious rooms, I was someone. I had the gift. Marin had said so herself, and Marin said almost nothing kind to anyone. "Your hands understand heat," she told me once, watching me pull a batch of honey-glazed duck from the oven with the precise timing that separated good cooking from transcendent cooking. "Most cooks learn technique. You were born with instinct." I had held those words close for 5 years like a candle against the dark. The autumn I turned 22, the palace was in absolute chaos. The crown prince, His Royal Highness Justin Perry, first of his name heir to the throne of Aldenmere, was to be formally bonded. Now, for those unfamiliar with the customs of our kingdom, an alpha of noble blood does not simply marry, they bond. It is a biological and ceremonial fusion, a soul-deep connection that, once made, cannot be unmade without significant suffering for both parties. The alpha's scent changes, the omega's designation deepens. They become, in the most literal physiological sense, two halves of a single complete person. It is considered the most sacred act in our society. It is also, in the case of royalty, an excruciatingly political one. Prince Justin had been promised to Lady Celeste Verne, the eldest daughter of Duke Verne of the Eastern Territories. The match had been arranged for 3 years. Lady Celeste was everything a royal bonding partner was supposed to be, exquisitely beautiful, impeccably mannered, of a lineage so pure it practically glowed in the dark, and an Omega whose presentation had occurred at exactly the right age and with exactly the right strength of signal. She was, by every measurable standard, perfect. I had seen her exactly once, when she arrived at the palace for the pre-bonding ceremonies. She had swept through the corridor near the kitchen entrance, the servants' corridor, not the formal gallery, because a kitchen delivery had caused a temporary blockage of the main hall, and her perfume had wafted ahead of her like a herald, lilac and cool stone. Expensive, correct. I pressed myself against the wall with 3 other kitchen staff, our eyes dutifully lowered, and thought, she is exactly what he deserves. I meant it sincerely. I had never spoken to Prince Justin. I had seen him perhaps a dozen times in 5 years, always at a distance, always surrounded by the golden haze of his position. Once at a state banquet, watching from the kitchen doorway as the serving staff carried out my platters, once in the garden during an autumn festival, glimpsed through a window while I was elbow-deep in pastry dough, once memorably when he had walked through the kitchen corridor himself, not the done thing, highly irregular, and Marin had nearly fainted, looking for something or someone, his dark gold hair disheveled and his expression carrying that particular quality of a man who is searching for something he cannot name. That time, he had looked at me directly. I had looked back, for perhaps 3 seconds, which is 2 seconds longer than propriety allowed. Then Marin's hand had landed on my shoulder and physically turned me toward the stove, and I had not looked again. That was 6 months before the bonding ceremony. I thought of those 3 seconds sometimes, in the way that you think of things that meant nothing and still somehow manage to mean everything. The preparations for the bonding ceremony consumed the palace entirely. Every department was affected. The florists worked from before sunrise. The protocol department issued 17 revised documents about the precise order of events. The seamstresses were apparently operating on no sleep whatsoever, based on the hollow-eyed state of the one I passed in the corridor on my way to the pre-dawn bread shift. For the kitchens, the challenge was the bonding feast itself. It is tradition that the bonding feast reflects both parties' heritage. For Lady Celeste, this meant certain dishes from the Eastern Territories, specialties I had studied carefully, but never made in a formal context. For Prince Justin, the royal family's traditional celebration dishes applied: the glazed boar, the river fish and cream sauce, the layered honey cake that was served at every major royal event going back 4 generations. Marin assigned me the honey cake. This was either a profound vote of confidence or a terrifying amount of responsibility, possibly both. The honey cake required 8 hours of preparation over 2 days. The layers had to be individually baked and cooled, then assembled with a cream made from specific mountain honey that was delivered to the palace twice a year. If the layers were even slightly uneven in temperature when assembled, the cream would separate. If the honey was a fraction too warm, the whole structure would weep and collapse. It was, Marin said grimly, the most technically demanding preparation in the entire feast. She gave it to me. "Don't let me down, Rush," was all she said. 3 words. I treasured them like gold. I began the cake 2 days before the ceremony. Day 1 went perfectly. The layers emerged from the oven with the faint golden color that indicated exactly the right degree of caramelization. I cooled them on the marble slabs as tradition demanded. I slept in the kitchen, waking every few hours to check the temperature. Day 2 was when everything started to go wrong. Not with the cake. The cake was fine, actually, progressing beautifully. The mountain honey was the correct consistency. The cream was responding well. The assembly was proceeding with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing, bone deep, that you are doing something correctly. What went wrong was the pantry. Specifically, the locked storeroom at the back of the main pantry, which held the rarest and most expensive ingredients, had been broken into. Not by a thief, by a mouse apparently, which had managed to infiltrate the seal and, in the course of its explorations, had chewed through the cord holding a shelf which had collapsed, which had knocked over the bottle of aged vinegar from the eastern province that was supposed to go into Lady Celeste's traditional wedding sauce, which had shattered on the stone floor, which had caused an extremely expensive puddle and an entirely irreplaceable ingredient loss. We discovered this at 4 in the morning, 14 hours before the ceremony. Marin's reaction to this news was quiet. Far too quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a thunderstorm of truly spectacular proportions. "Rush," she said, after approximately 45 seconds of absolute silence. "The Eastern vinegar. Is there any substitute?" I had been awake for 19 hours. My brain was running on honey cake tension and a single cup of bitter morning tea. And yet, some part of me, the part that Marin had once said was born with instinct, reached immediately for the answer. "There is," I said carefully, "a reduction. If I take the late harvest grape concentrate from the lower cellar and reduce it with the aged herb bundle and a small measure of the dark plum preserve, and then it won't be identical. But the flavor profile would be close enough that anyone who hadn't tasted the original recently wouldn't detect the difference." Marin looked at me for a long moment. "Do it," she said. "And Rush, if this fails, it fails on you. Understood?" Good, don't fail. I did not fail. But in the process of retrieving the late harvest grape concentrate from the lower cellar at approximately 4:30 in the morning, carrying a lamp in one hand and a large ceramic jar under my other arm, I rounded a corner in the dimly lit storage corridor and walked directly into Prince Justin Perry. There are moments in a life that occur with such total unexpectedness that the brain simply refuses to process them in real time. It receives the information. Tall man, dark gold hair, blue-gray eyes, the unmistakable warm amber scent of a presenting alpha, and then it quietly sets that information aside to be dealt with later, because there is simply no appropriate immediate response. I walked into him shoulder first. The lamp swung wildly. The ceramic jar lurched. His hands caught it. Both of his hands moving with a reflexive speed that suggested someone who had spent considerable time training wrapped around the jar before it could fall. We stood there in the narrow corridor, both holding the jar between us, the lamplight throwing his face into sharp relief, and I became aware of several things simultaneously. First, this was Prince Justin Perry, in the servants' storage corridor at 4:30 in the morning, in plain clothes, not livery, not formal wear, just dark linen trousers and a shirt that was, astonishingly, untucked. Second, his scent was significantly stronger than it had been from a distance, warm amber and something deeper, like the first cold night of autumn when the wood smoke rises and the harvest is in. It was the scent of a dominant alpha, and my omega biology, which I generally kept firmly suppressed through sheer willpower and the distracting power of professional cooking, noted this with embarrassing enthusiasm. Third, he was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. Not annoyance, not alarm, something more like recognition, though we had, as far as I knew, never been formally introduced. "The jar?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. "Yes," he agreed. His voice it was exactly the voice I had expected him to have, which is to say it was unfair, low and clear, the kind of voice that carries in a large room without effort. Neither of us released the jar. "I need it," I said, "for the feast preparation." "What are you making?" "At this hour, a vinegar reduction to substitute for the Eastern ingredient that was destroyed approximately an hour ago due to a structural failure in the pantry storeroom caused by rodent interference." A pause. His expression shifted. The recognition sharpened into something that might have been amusement. "A mouse destroyed the Eastern vinegar." "Yes, Your Highness. 14 hours before my bonding ceremony." "Yes, Your Highness." He looked down at the jar, then back at me. He had not, I noticed, released the jar. "Will the substitute work?" "Yes. It won't be identical, but it will be very good. Lady Celeste won't know the difference unless she has had the original dish recently and has an exceptionally precise palate." "She does," he said, "have a precise palate. She mentioned it during our meeting last month. She said she can identify the vintage of a wine within 3 years." I considered this. That could be a problem. "How much of a problem?" "How much of a problem?" "Moderate. I'll add a touch more of the aged herb infusion to bring the acidity profile closer to the original. It should close the gap significantly." He was quiet for a moment. And then, "This is the part I am still not sure I have fully processed even now." He said, "Can I watch?" I stared at him. "The preparation," he added, as if this required clarification. "I've never actually seen kitchen work done, the real kind. I've watched demonstrations, but those are staged. I'd like to see what it actually looks like at 4 in the morning when something's gone wrong." I should have said no. Every rule of propriety, every instinct of self-preservation, every awareness of the vast social distance between a crown prince who was 14 hours from his bonding ceremony and a kitchen boy from a river town said, "No, Your Highness, I must ask you to return to your chambers. This is not appropriate." I said, "You'll need to stay back from the fire and not speak while I'm measuring." His mouth curved. "Just slightly." "Agreed." He stayed for 2 hours. He sat on an upturned crate near the back wall of the main kitchen. Marin was doing the Eastern sauce preparations in the adjoining room, and the other kitchen staff were occupied with various tasks, and somehow, in the way that impossible things sometimes happen simply because nobody thinks to prevent them, the Crown Prince of Aldemir sat on a crate in the royal kitchens and watched me make a vinegar reduction at 5 in the morning. He did not speak while I measured. He kept this part of the bargain with a precision that surprised me. When I began the reduction itself, the long, careful process of bringing the grape concentrate to the right temperature and maintaining it there, he spoke quietly without disrupting the work. He asked questions. Not the performative questions of someone who is asking to seem engaged, the real questions of someone who is genuinely curious. What did I look for in the color of the reduction to know when the temperature was right? How did I decide on the ratio of herb to concentrate? Had I ever made this particular substitution before, or was I working from theory? I answered him. Also quietly, at some point I became aware that this was extraordinary, that the hair on the back of my neck was standing up in the particular way that it does when an alpha's scent is in close proximity and the omega biology is making its opinions loudly known, and that I was having a conversation with the future king of Aldenmere about flavor chemistry while he sat on a crate in my kitchen wearing an untucked shirt. "You speak about it like it's a science," he said. "It is a science, also an art. Most good things are both." "And you prefer it?" "Cooking, I mean. You chose this?" I glanced at him then, briefly, keeping one eye on the reduction. "I don't know if I'd say I chose it. It chose me. Or maybe it was the only door that was open. I'm not sure the distinction matters." He was quiet for a moment. "I find that honest. Most people tell me they'd be doing exactly this, even if they had every other option." "I might be doing exactly this, even if I had every other option," I admitted. "But I can't know that for certain. I've never had every other option. He looked at me with that unclassifiable expression again. What's your name? Carl Rush. Junior sous chef under head cook Marin. Carl, he tried the name. The way he said it, like he was placing it carefully somewhere, did something uncomfortable to my chest. I've seen you before. Once, I said, before I could stop myself. In this corridor, 6 months ago. The briefest pause. You remember that? You looked directly at me. It was unusual. I don't forget unusual things. I remember it too, he said quietly. The reduction bubbled. I turned my attention back to it with what I hoped was professional composure. He left before the morning staff began arriving in full force. He stood, stretched in a way that suggested he had been still for longer than he was comfortable with, and looked around the kitchen with an expression I could only describe as wanting. Thank you, he said, for letting me stay. You didn't ask permission. Another curve of his mouth. No. I suppose I didn't. Does that bother you? I considered this honestly. No. But it might have if you'd been less. I stopped. Less what? Less like yourself, I said, which made no sense and perfect sense simultaneously. He seemed to understand it. He nodded once, and then he walked toward the corridor, and I watched him go because I had apparently decided that propriety was a concern for a future version of me who had gotten more sleep. At the door, he paused and looked back. The cake, he said. The honey cake. Marin always makes it for the major ceremonies. She gave it to me this time. Something in his face changed, just slightly. Good, he said. I'm glad. Then he was gone, and I stood in the kitchen with the reduction simmering perfectly behind me and my heart doing something medically questionable in my chest, and I thought, that is the end of that. That is a story that will never go anywhere. That was 2 hours in a kitchen, and now he will go bond with Lady Celeste Verne, and I will serve the feast from behind the kitchen door. And the extraordinary 3 seconds of eye contact 6 months ago will become the extraordinary 2 hours of 5 in the morning conversation. And it will all recede into the category of things that happened once and meant everything in the moment and must be firmly classified as nothing thereafter. I turned back to my work. I did not think about the way he said my name. I thought about it constantly. The bonding ceremony itself happens in 2 parts. The first part is public. The formal declaration before the assembled court and nobility. The exchange of words that have been the same for 400 years. The ritual presentation of scent. This is the legal and political act. This is what makes it binding in the eyes of the kingdom's governance. The second part is private, the biological completion of the bond, which occurs afterward in a chamber prepared for exactly this purpose with only the bonding parties present. The alpha's instincts take over. The omega's biology responds. The bond forms at a level that goes beyond choice. It is the body completing what the ceremony declares. This is why bonding is taken so seriously. You cannot bond a person you find repellent. The alpha's body will not respond to an omega their deeper self rejects, no matter what politics demands. There have been failed bonding ceremonies in history, not many, but enough to be cautionary tales, enough to ensure that the pre-bonding meetings between parties are taken extremely seriously. I knew all of this in the abstract. Kitchen staff learn a great deal about palace customs simply by being present, by hearing conversations, by absorbing the knowledge that circulates through a closed community like water through stone. What I did not know on the morning of the ceremony was that somewhere between the formal declaration and the private chamber, something had gone wrong. I learned this the way all kitchen staff learn things, through the servant network that moves faster than any official communication. The first signal was the arrival of the head protocol officer in the kitchen doorway, an event so unprecedented that Marin actually dropped a spoon, which was the first time in 5 years I had seen her lose her grip on anything. The feast will be delayed, he said, his face carrying the expression of a man who has been asked to hold an ocean in a teacup. By perhaps 2 hours. Please make the appropriate preparations. He left. Marin looked at me. Well, she said, in the tone of someone who has decided that the world is doing its chaos and the kitchen will do its certainty. Rush. Check the cake. Everything else, we hold and reheat as needed. The cake was fine. The cake was, if anything, at its absolute peak. The cream had set perfectly, the layers had achieved that particular structural integrity that meant it could be transported without disaster. The honey glaze was exactly the right depth of amber. I stood over it and tried not to think about what a 2-hour delay to a bonding ceremony meant. Then someone said, in the corridor outside the kitchen, in a voice that was not bothering to be quiet about it, simply refused. The prince. Just refused. in front of the Duke and everyone. He just stood there and said he couldn't complete it, that he was sorry, that it was nothing against Lady Celeste, but he couldn't bond with her. The silence that followed this piece of information was geological. I stood over the honey cake with a serving spatula in my hand and thought about warm amber scent and an untucked shirt and a question asked at 5 in the morning, and you prefer it? Cooking, I mean. I remember it too. I set the spatula down very carefully. The feast did not happen that day. The official announcement came in the late afternoon. The bonding ceremony had been postponed. Lady Celeste Viorn had departed the palace with her family. There would be no further public comment until the Crown Prince had addressed the court, which would occur in 3 days. The kitchen staff were given the evening off, which nobody quite knew what to do with. We had been preparing for a feast that didn't happen. There was more food in the palace than could reasonably be consumed by the household in a week. I carried the honey cake back to the cold store personally. I was not going to leave 5 years' worth of skill sitting out to go to waste regardless of the circumstances. I was returning from the cold store, lamp in hand, navigating the now very familiar storage corridor when I found him there again. Justin Perry, Crown Prince of Aldenmere, was sitting on the floor of the storage corridor with his back against the stone wall and his forearms resting on his bent knees and his head tipped back, eyes closed, looking like a man who had just done something very difficult and was not entirely sure he had survived it. I stopped. He opened his eyes. Whatever expression he had been wearing alone shifted into something else. Not quite surprise. Something closer to inevitability. "Carl," he said, "Your Highness." I looked at him. He looked at me. The lamp between us threw everything into amber. "Are you all right?" A pause. The question clearly landed in an unexpected place. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I think I will be. I think I did the right thing. I'm not certain I did the wise thing. Those are apparently different." "They often are," I said. "I should have excused myself. I should have been anywhere else. Do you want company? Or would you prefer I walked past and pretended I hadn't seen you?" His mouth did the thing it had done twice this morning, just the edge of a curve. "I prefer company," he said, "if it's yours." I sat on the floor of the storage corridor, 4 feet from the Crown Prince, my lamp between us. "Why are you down here?" he asked after a moment. "The honey cake. It needed to go in cold storage. I wasn't going to leave it." He was quiet. "Then, I've destroyed the feast it was made for?" "You've preserved the feast for a better occasion," I said. "The cake isn't ruined, it's just waiting." He looked at me. Something in his face was doing something I didn't have a name for yet. "Why did you do it?" I asked. I had no right to ask. The words came out anyway. "If you want to tell me." "You don't have to." He was silent for long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Do you know what happens when an alpha is standing before their intended omega for the bonding declaration and their body simply goes still?" He said at last. "When the instinct that's supposed to ignite just doesn't? When everything in your biology is saying, this isn't right, this is not the one?" I didn't speak. It doesn't matter how beautiful she is, or how perfect she is on paper, or how much political sense the match makes. Your body knows. An alpha can't fake the bond. You can go through the ceremony, but if the deeper response isn't there, the biological bond won't form, and you'll just be 2 people standing in a room who've said words at each other. He exhaled slowly. I couldn't do that to her. It would have been dishonest. It would have been cruel. "So you stopped," I said. So I stopped. The corridor was very quiet. The palace above us had absorbed the shock of the day and settled into a kind of held breath stillness. "Has it ever?" I stopped. "Ask," he said. "Has it ever happened before?" The response, "With someone else." He turned his head to look at me. The lamplight between us felt suddenly extremely significant. "Once," he said. And I didn't understand it until today. Until standing in that room and realizing the absence of it. My heart was doing the medically questionable thing again with additional intensity. "Carl," he said. "Justin," I said, and then hearing myself amended, "Your Highness." "Justin," he corrected quietly. "Right now, in this corridor, just Justin." I looked at him. He looked at me. The amber light sat between us like a truth neither of us had spoken yet. "This is very complicated," I said. "Yes," he agreed, "and probably inadvisable." "Almost certainly. And you have to address the court in 3 days. I'm aware, and I'm a kitchen boy from a river town. You're an artist who makes substitutions at 5 in the morning and talks about cooking like it's both science and faith, he said. And you're the only person who has looked at me in years as though you're seeing me rather than the crown. I was quiet for a long moment. The thing about working in a kitchen, the real thing, the thing that goes deeper than technique and instinct, is that you learn to recognize when something is at exactly the right moment, when the heat and the ingredient and the time have aligned, when you move now or you lose it. When you were watching me work this morning, I said carefully, what were you thinking? He didn't hesitate, that I didn't want to leave, that every time I've seen you from a distance over the past years, something in me, oriented toward you, like a compass finding north, and I kept moving away from it because it made no political sense and because I told myself I was imagining it. Were you? I asked. Imagining it. No, he said. Were you? No, I said. He didn't kiss me that night in the corridor. I want to be honest about the timeline because the story matters and the details matter. What happened was, we sat on the floor of that corridor for another hour talking. Actually talking. The way two people talk when they have run out of reasons to be careful, when the protective scaffolding of propriety and position has been acknowledged as inadequate and temporarily set aside. He told me about the pressure of the bonding arrangement. I told him about my mother, my brothers, the way I had arrived at the palace gates at 17 with a letter of recommendation and a terror I had not allowed myself to name. He talked about what it was like to be an alpha who was expected to bond for political reasons, and had spent years pretending that the emptiness of that expectation was something he could simply endure. I talked about what it was like to be an Omega who had suppressed his designation so thoroughly out of professional necessity that some days he almost forgot it was there. When I said that, he went very still. You've been suppressing, he said. Not a question. For years. It's easy enough if you're busy enough. The kitchen is. I know, he said. I could tell, when you were working, you weren't projecting at all. And then when you were still. When I was still. He looked at me with an expression that was very close to helpless. When you were still, your scent was. It's like the kitchen, but warmer. Something warm and fresh and… He stopped himself. Exhaled. I should stop. Probably, I agreed. My voice was not entirely steady. We looked at each other in the lamplight. Carl, he said. Don't, I said. Not tonight. You just stopped a bonding ceremony and you need to address the court in 3 days, and we should be careful about what tonight is versus what it could actually be. He was quiet. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're right. I'm often right, I said. It's one of my better qualities. That surprised a real laugh out of him. Brief, quiet, genuine. The laugh of someone who hasn't laughed in a while and is slightly startled to find themselves doing it. It was the most dangerous sound I had ever heard. I stood up, gathered my lamp, and extended a hand to help him up. He took it. His hand was warm, alpha warm, the baseline body temperature slightly elevated, which my biology noted with pointed interest. We stood facing each other in the narrow corridor, his hand still in mine, not quite close enough to be improper and not quite far enough to be comfortable. 3 days, I said. 3 days, he agreed. I walked back to the kitchen. I did not sleep particularly well. He addressed the court in 3 days as promised. I heard about it secondhand, through the servant network that never slept. The address was by all accounts composed and clear and unflinching. He did not apologize for stopping the ceremony, though he expressed regret for the disruption, and committed to addressing the political consequences with the Duke's family through appropriate diplomatic channels. He told the court that a forced bonding, one proceeding without the genuine biological connection, was not something he was willing to do to any Omega. He said this not as an excuse but as a principle. The court apparently was divided. Half admired the honesty. Half were appalled by the political fallout. A small but vocal contingent were already murmuring about the need for a second approved candidate and a new timeline. What nobody was talking about publicly was why the biological connection had been absent. What nobody knew, yet, was what had caused it to be absent. In those 3 days, I worked. I cooked. I kept my head down and my hands busy and my suppression steady, and I was very, very careful not to look toward the upper palace when I carried deliveries through the connecting corridors. On the third evening, a folded note appeared under my sleeping room door. Kitchen side entrance. After midnight. If you're willing. No signature. None needed. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it, put it in my pocket, and went back to work. After midnight, the palace had a different quality. The formal spaces were empty, and the corridors carried sound strangely, amplifying footsteps and breath. I went to the kitchen side entrance, a door that opened onto a small courtyard used for deliveries and waste removal, not exactly romantic in the conventional sense, and found him there, leaning against the stone wall in the cold air, his breath misting faintly. He was wearing the dark linen and the untucked shirt again, or possibly different versions of them. The aesthetic was the same. "You came," he said. "I'm here," I confirmed. We stood in the courtyard looking at each other. The moon was doing something very unfair with the light. "I know what I want," he said quietly. "I've known for a while. I'm trying to understand what it means practically, what it would ask of you. If it's something you want." Without the weight of what I am making it impossible to answer honestly, I considered him for a long moment. The careful way he had constructed that sentence, the very deliberate attempt to give me space to say no. "Justin," I said, "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer directly. Yes, your alpha instinct, the thing that was absent with Lady Celeste, is it present now?" He held very still. "Yes," he said. "It's been present since the corridor." "Since before the corridor?" "Since P stopped." "Yes." "And you understand what that means? Not just the feeling of it, but the commitment of it." "I understand it more completely than I've understood anything in my life." I crossed the courtyard. I stood in front of him. I was several inches shorter than he was, which I was aware of in a way I had not been in the lamplight of the corridor. "I'm a kitchen boy," I said. "I have no title, no land, no lineage that anyone would consider significant. My presentation is deliberately suppressed because I've spent years making myself professionally invisible. The court will have opinions about this that will not be gentle. I know, and you've thought about it. For 3 days without sleeping particularly well, yes. And your conclusion?" He looked at me. His eyes in the moonlight were the color of winter sky. "That none of those things change what my body knows about yours, and that a kingdom that would rather its prince bond unhappily for political convenience than genuinely for something real is a kingdom whose priorities I'm not interested in serving." I looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very good answer," I said. "I had 3 days to prepare it. And the honest version?" His composure cracked, just slightly. Just the edge of something underneath the composure. Something that was uncertain and hopeful and very, very real. "The honest version," he said, "is that I have been looking for you in every room I enter for 6 months without knowing that's what I was doing. And when I found you in that corridor the first time, something in me finally stopped looking. And I don't know how to explain that beyond what it is." I reached up and put my hand against the side of his face. He went very still, the way something goes still when it has been waiting for something and the thing has finally arrived. "Okay," I said. He exhaled. The tension in him released, slowly like a tide going out. "Okay?" he asked. "Okay. We figure this out. Together. I'm not promising it won't be extraordinarily complicated, because it obviously will be. But okay." He covered my hand with his, pressing it more firmly against his face. His warmth was the same as it had been in the corridor, alpha warm, certain, present. "Carl," he said. "Justin," I said back. He leaned down. I stayed still. He kissed me with the careful precision of someone who has been wanting to do something for a long time and is determined to get it exactly right. It was exactly right. The next weeks were, as I had promised, extraordinarily complicated. Not immediately. Immediately they were something else. Something that lived in the hours between midnight and dawn in the courtyard and in the kitchen side entrance, and once memorably in the small reading room off the lower gallery where Justin apparently retreated when he needed to think, and where I found him at an unusual hour and where we spent 3 hours not reading and not thinking about anything except each other. The alpha bonding instinct, once recognized and no longer suppressed, has a quality that I can only describe as gravity. It does not pull dramatically. It does not announce itself. It simply makes its presence known as an absolute law of the universe, the way gravity does. Something you become aware of not because it changes, but because you stop pretending it isn't there. For him, it manifested as a steady certainty that was different from anything else I had seen in his face. In formal contexts, he was composed and precise and royal. With me, he was present in a way that felt different. Turned toward me the way Marin had once said, My hands turned toward heat. For me, it was harder to describe. I had suppressed my Omega designation for so long that allowing it to simply exist felt strange. Vulnerable in a way I hadn't been since I was 17 and arriving at palace gates with a letter and a terror. The suppression had been armor. Letting it down was not something that happened all at once. It happened in increments, a scent acknowledged, a warmth accepted, a certainty that began to settle around Justin's presence the way you settle into something that fits. The political reality arrived, as political realities do, like a season. First there was the matter of Duke Vorn, who had to be placated. Justin handled this personally with a combination of diplomatic clarity and specific territorial concessions that I did not entirely understand, but that Mering described as expensive, but he's paying for the right thing, which is more than most of them manage. Maren had opinions about everything, including things that were technically none of her business. I had learned to appreciate this. Then there was the matter of the court itself. The court discovered the situation the way the court discovers everything, gradually, then all at once. First, the rumors circulated at the level of knowing looks and careful whispers. Then someone, likely someone who thought they were doing Justin a political service by forcing the issue, made it explicit in a formal session. The Crown Prince had been seen on multiple occasions in the company of a kitchen staff member. The Crown Prince's alpha presentation, which had been noted by multiple parties as having notably intensified in recent weeks, was directed toward said kitchen staff member. The implication was clear. Justin's response to the formal session was, from what I heard through the Servant Network, the kind of response that becomes part of a reign's defining mythology. He acknowledged it, directly, without qualification. He said that his bonding instinct had identified an Omega who was not of noble birth, and that he had spent considerable time examining whether this should change his course of action, and had concluded that biology and genuine connection together constituted a stronger foundation for a bond than lineage and politics together, and that he intended to pursue the matter with full intention and respectfulness toward all parties, including Karl Rush, who was not present to speak for himself and who deserved to have his dignity protected in this public context. He said my name in the formal session. I heard about this while knee-deep in afternoon bread preparation and had to sit down for a moment. Maren noticed. She did not comment. She simply handed me a cup of tea and went back to work, which was the most eloquent expression of support I had ever received from her. The complications were not only external. There was a conversation Justin and I had, 3 weeks into whatever we were doing, that I need to recount honestly because it was the hardest one and it was the one that mattered most. We were in the courtyard again, late, the stars doing their indifferent work overhead, and he had been quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness, more weighted, like he was carrying something. Tell me what you're thinking, I said. He looked at the sky for a moment. I'm thinking about what I'm asking of you, the bond. If we bond, Carl, your life changes completely, not just in the ways that might seem positive. In ways that might be, I don't know if you fully thought through what it would mean to bond with an alpha of my rank, the obligations it creates for you, the scrutiny. The parts of the life that aren't, he stopped. I don't want you to look at it through the light of what we are right now and miss the parts that are genuinely difficult. I was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about whether you're being selfish, I said. He exhaled. Yes, whether the gravity of your instinct toward me is creating a situation where I can't actually evaluate the choice clearly. Yes, I considered him. The careful, principled worry of him. The way he was trying even now to hold space for me to refuse. Justin, I said, I grew up in a river town with a dead merchant for a father and a mother with debts and no good options. I came to this palace at 17 with nothing. I have spent 5 years earning a reputation in a kitchen that I am proud of and that I built with my own hands. Do you know what that taught me? Tell me. It taught me that I know exactly what things cost. I have never had the luxury of not counting the cost of anything. I have evaluated this with the same clear eyes I use for everything, and I am telling you, I see the difficulty. I see the scrutiny and the obligations and the ways it's hard, and I'm telling you that I want this anyway. Not because your instinct is bending my judgment, because I have looked at you clearly, including the parts that are a complication, and the choice is still yes. He was silent for a long time. You're certain, he said finally. I'm certain. Are you? He looked at me. The gravity in his expression shifted. Since that first corridor, then stop being so thoughtful about it and let it be what it is, I said. A sound escaped him, something that was almost a laugh and partly something more serious. He reached for me in the dark of the courtyard, and I let myself be reached for, and we stayed there in the cold with the stars overhead and his warmth against the winter air. And it was the simplest and most complicated thing I had ever been a part of. The formal bond did not happen quickly. Formally, officially, in the eyes of the kingdom, it took 4 months from that night in the courtyard. 4 months of navigating the court's reaction, which was divided into three roughly equal camps: those who found it genuinely romantic and were cautiously supportive, those who found it politically reckless and were loudly opposed, and those who watched the way Justin's alpha instinct had noticeably deepened and his governance had sharpened and his certainty of self had become unmistakable, and who concluded, quietly, carefully, that perhaps the Crown Prince had found what he needed, regardless of whether it came in the expected packaging. 4 months of learning to exist in each other's lives in the practical sense, learning what he was like tired, what he was like under political pressure, what he was like when the weight of his position sat on him too heavily and he needed somewhere to put it down. Learning from his end what I was like when I was deep in a project and needed silence, what I was like after a day when something hadn't gone right in the kitchen and I was fighting down the frustration, what I was like when I was genuinely joyful. Which happened, he told me, most often when I was cooking something difficult and it was working, when the instinct and the technique and the moment aligned. "You look," he said, watching me one evening from his position on the upturned crate that had apparently become permanently his in the kitchen, "like the kitchen is where you're most yourself." "It might be," I agreed, without looking up from the sauce I was watching. "You could say the same of the court for you, couldn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. I'm not sure the court lets me be myself so much as perform a version of myself. The performance has become the self, maybe. Or maybe the self exists underneath and the performance has just become habit." I looked up at him then. "Is that what's different, lately?" He met my gaze. "Having somewhere the performance isn't required. Yes, it changes things. It's harder to perform when you've remembered what it feels like not to." 4 months of that kind of conversation, of discovering that the person underneath the crown was someone I would have liked regardless of what sat on his head. Someone with a mind that worked sideways, that found unexpected angles on problems. Someone with a dry wit that only appeared when he trusted the company. Someone who carried responsibility seriously without letting it make him rigid. Someone who, when I set food in front of him, ate it with the genuine attention of a person who valued the experience, not a performance of appreciation, but actual, present, careful pleasure. He was, I discovered, someone who had been waiting his whole life to be allowed to care about something real. I discovered, someone who had been waiting his whole life to be seen. The bonding ceremony was nothing like the one that had been planned for Lady Celeste. For one thing, it was small. Justin had been firm about this. The formal public declaration would happen as required by law. But the ceremony itself would be intimate. The required witnesses, the officiant, no audience beyond what was legally necessary. He said he didn't want the most private thing they were doing to be a spectacle. He said this while looking at me very directly, making clear that he was offering me the choice. I said small was exactly right. For another thing, the preparation for this ceremony was different. No political negotiations of territorial implications, no pageant of noble obligation. Just what was true, what they both knew to be true. The night before, I baked. Not the honey cake this time. I was saving that, I had told Justin, for a specific occasion, and the occasion would be when there was something worth celebrating properly. The night before the ceremony, I made a small loaf of the seeded bread that my mother used to make, that I had learned from her hands before I was old enough for the memory to be particularly coherent, that I had been refining ever since until it was exactly the version she had made, which was the version I carried inside me as the definition of the word home. I brought it to the small reading room off the lower gallery. Justin looked at it, then at me. "This is your mother's bread," he said. He had heard about it weeks ago, in one of the late-night conversations. "Yes," I said. I stopped. "Tried again. I thought tomorrow there would be a lot of things that belong to your world. The ceremony and the words and the formal witness. I wanted there to be one thing that was mine." He was quiet for a long moment. "Can I try it?" he asked. I cut him a piece. He ate it slowly, with the careful attention he gave to everything I made, and I watched his face do what it always did when something reached him, that small, quiet shift, like a door opening inward. It tastes like warmth, he said finally. That's what home tastes like, I said. He looked at me. Yes, he said softly. That's exactly what it tastes like. We ate the bread together at the small table in the low light, and it was the most ceremonial thing that happened in that 24 hours, even though nobody would have called it that. The formal declaration was in the morning. The required witnesses were present. The officiant was the kingdom's bonding officiator, an older woman named Priestess Hale who had been doing this for 30 years and who, to my relief, treated both of us with the same matter-of-fact gravity regardless of the asymmetry of our stations. Justin stood across from me in the small, formal room that had been prepared for the ceremony. He was in his formal dress, the first time I had seen him in it without a crowd around him, and he looked like exactly what he was, which was the crown prince of Aldenmere, the heir to a 400-year throne, a figure of considerable power and presence. He also looked like the man who had sat on an upturned crate in my kitchen with his shirt untucked and asked me questions about flavor chemistry. Both things were true simultaneously. Both things would always be true. That was the version of him I was bonding with. The whole thing, the crown and the untucked shirt both. He was looking at me the way he had looked at me in every late-night corridor and every small room and every honest conversation, like I was a compass point. The words of the Declaration were 400 years old, and they were, it occurred to me, genuinely beautiful. About recognition. About the deeper self's knowing. About choice made in the presence of that knowing, as an act of both acknowledgement and commitment. When it was my turn to speak my part, I said the words clearly, in the voice that had not broken once in 5 years of kitchen work. Regardless of the heat or the hour or the difficulty, I meant every syllable. The biological completion of the bond, the part that happens between only the two parties, is not something I will describe in detail. It belongs to Justin and me alone, in the way that some things must belong to only the people who shared them. What I will say is, there is a reason the bond is considered sacred. There is a reason it is treated with such gravity and care and ceremony, because when it forms, when the alpha's instinct and the omega's recognition meet at the level where biology becomes something bigger than biology, it is not simply physical. It is the sensation of something that was always true becoming undeniable, of a shape you had been carrying without knowing it suddenly filled. It felt like being seen completely, all of it, all the way down to the Rivertown boy with flour under his fingernails and a terror he had not named, and that boy was not insufficient. That boy was, in fact, exactly enough. I cried. Quietly. Briefly. He held me through it without comment, which was the correct response. Then we sat together in the silence of the aftermath, and I was aware of the bond in the way you become aware of your heartbeat, not as something new, but as something that had always been true and was now simply impossible to not perceive. Well, I said, eventually. Well, he agreed. The court is going to have ongoing opinions about this. Yes, and the political situation with Duke Forn still needs to be formally resolved. It does. And my position in the kitchen will need to be renegotiated diplomatically. Marin has already submitted a formal request for your retention as a continuing consultant on the Royal Kitchen's important projects, he said. I approved it this morning. I turned my head to look at him. She did, in writing, with specific requirements about the honey cake. I stared at him. What did she say about the honey cake? That it remains Rush's responsibility as long as Rush is available, and that this arrangement is non-negotiable. He paused. She underlined non-negotiable. I laughed. A real one, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected and genuine. He watched me with the expression that I was beginning to understand was specifically for me, the one that appeared when I was joyful in the unguarded way, the kitchen-working way. She knew, I said. Didn't she? Marin knew. She gave you the honey cake, he said simply. She gave me the honey cake. The most technically demanding preparation, the one that required presence and instinct and 2 days of careful attention, the one that, in the chaos of the ceremony's cancellation and the mouse in the vinegar and the 5 in the morning conversation, had set all of this in motion. Marin, who said almost nothing kind to anyone, who had spent 5 years watching me work with the particular sharp attention of someone who sees things clearly, Marin, who had given me the honey cake. 6 months after the bonding ceremony, the palace threw what was officially called a belated celebration feast in honor of the Crown Prince's bonding. This was, diplomatically, the correct framing. Informally, it was the feast that the bonding ceremony had promised and the politics had delayed, finally allowed to be itself. The preparation began, as all the best preparations began, in the pre-dawn hours. I was in the kitchen by 4 in the morning. Not because I had to be, my position in the formal household had been renegotiated in exactly the way the diplomatic language required, and I now held a title that the protocol office had spent 3 weeks arguing about and finally settled on as Royal Culinary Advisor, which Marin thought was extremely funny. But I was in the kitchen at 4 because the kitchen was where I wanted to be, on the morning of the occasion worth celebrating, making the thing that had been waiting, the honey cake. Marin arrived at 5, which was 40 minutes earlier than she needed to be. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched me for a moment. "You started without me," she said. "I had the instinct," I told her. A pause. "So you did." She came in. She stood at the marble slab beside me and looked at the layers cooling in their careful order. She did not say anything for a long time. "Then, I was right about you." "You were," I agreed. "The instinct. I saw it the first week." "I know." She looked at me directly. In 5 years, it was one of very few times she had done so. "He's good," she said. "The prince. He came to the kitchen the morning after the ceremony that didn't happen. Did you know that?" I looked up. "No, he came to ask me about you. Not in the way you might expect. He didn't ask your history or your standing. He asked what you were good at." She paused. "I told him you were good at knowing when something was at the right moment, when to move and when to wait." Another pause. "He said he knew." I looked at the honey cake layers cooling on the marble. 6 months. A bonding ceremony stopped. A corridor. A 5 in the morning conversation about flavor chemistry. A courtyard in winter. A small loaf of seeded bread in a reading room. A bond formed in the presence of 400 years of formal words and one quietly complete truth. "Marin," I said, "thank you for the cake." She made a sound that was not quite dismissive and not quite acknowledged. "Don't thank me. Cook the feast." I cooked the feast. Justin arrived in the kitchen at 8, which was not protocol and never had been and had ceased to be a subject of comment among the kitchen staff approximately 2 months ago. He moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had spent enough hours in it to no longer feel like an intrusion, and who had been gradually accepted into the particular ecosystem of the space in the way that the kitchen accepted anything, by seeing what it could do and deciding it had a place. He came and stood beside me and looked at the cake in its final assembled glory, the layers perfect and the cream set and the honey glaze at exactly the right depth of amber. "That's it," he said. "That's it. It's been waiting 6 months." "Some things are worth waiting for," I said. "Once they're at the right moment, they're worth every hour of patience." He turned to look at me with the expression that was specifically mine, the one that lived underneath the crown and the composure and the alpha certainty, the one that was just Justin in an untucked shirt in the early morning, looking at me like a compass at north. "Yes," he said, "they are." Marin, from across the kitchen, without looking up from her own work. "Rush." "The glaze." I turned back to the cake. "The glaze," I confirmed. Justin retreated to his crate. I finished the honey cake with the last of the mountain cream and the particular quality of care that you give to things that have waited the right amount of time and arrived at exactly the right moment. And I thought, this is what a life looks like when it is finally actually fully itself. The kitchen blazed with heat. The feast waited to be served. Somewhere above us, the palace was waking into the day of the celebration. And here in the low-ceilinged, steam-filled, glorious room that had been the whole world, and then the doorway to a larger one, I worked with my hands and my instinct and my carefully earned knowledge. And beside me was the warmth of someone whose presence felt as fundamental as gravity, as undeniable as heat, as completely and correctly right as a cake layer pulled from the oven at exactly the proper moment, not a second too early, not a second too late. Some things you know, bone deep. Some things know you back. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.